emotional reactivity. And I'm going to try to leave a little time at the end in case the talk triggers anyone wanting to share some of their experiences of working with reactivity, because it's such a big sort of umbrella issue. In the past year, probably, Sharon's given a number of talks on working with difficult emotions, and those talks really inspired me as I began to think about this talk. And I wanted to sort of dig a little deeper on this one aspect of working with difficult emotions. And it also seemed timely in terms of this time of year where we're interacting with family and there's a lot going on in the world and in the country. I just thought it was a good time to sort of reflect on this topic. And you recall that one of the basic tenets of Buddhist teaching really addresses the need to manage our emotions as a way of making progress on the spiritual path. We just can't be all over the place emotionally and expect to make real progress with our practice. And so I think managing emotional reactivity, and I'll define that a little bit in a moment, is really fundamental to achieving equanimity, achieving acceptance of things as they are as we go through our day-to-day lives. And as I was thinking about it, I was thinking that in some ways, if we throw the net wide enough, that most of what we encounter could come under this general heading. I know that in almost 43 years of practice, that most of what would come through the door of my office would have something to do, in a broad sense, with emotional reactivity and the difficulty that we all have with managing it and making it work for us in our lives. And in terms of our practice, I think we just talk about an unskillful tendency to be controlled by our emotions as sort of one definition of reactivity. So if our emotions are really driving the car, that's one way we would define reactivity. And you could also, I think, talk about dukkha, the Pali word for suffering, as another way of defining reactivity. And I hope that'll become clearer as we talk about it some tonight. But suffice it to say that when the mind is at ease, when we're quiet, that it's unlikely that in those moments we're going to be reactive. We're really going to be more inclined to be more introspective, more settled, and more able to reflect. So as I was thinking about it, it occurred to me there's multiple manifestations, as I said a moment ago. And we can talk about reactivity within ourselves individually, things like emotions like guilt and shame. Self-criticism could be one form. Reactivity can be relational in nature, anger, conflict, or it can be social, taking sides, us versus them, being very emotionally reactive to the out group or the group from whom we feel separate or different. And of course, all of these things lead to more suffering. I mean, the bottom line, again, is in so much of what we talk about, is the sources of suffering. And if you think about it, I mean, we get triggered. We get triggered in all kinds of ways. We get triggered by those around us who push our buttons, to use that term. We certainly push our own buttons in terms of issues that come up with us and how we manage them as they come up. And again, leads to more suffering. So I want to talk about it for a couple moments about, from the sort of perspective of the Dharma. And then we'll get into it a little more deeply. But the Pali word citta, it's actually spelled C-I-T-T-A, pronounced citta. It's usually translated to mean heart-mind. And when the Buddha talks about heart-mind, what he's really saying is that they're inseparable. That what happens in the mind and the heart, the thoughts, the thought processes, the heart being the seat of our emotions in that typology, he said they were inseparable. You can't talk about one without the other. And he addresses it as really being a consciousness of both what's going on with our thoughts and what's going with our emotions, that we need to be able to sit with that, recognize that, work with that, allow that to come up, and respond to it in a skillful manner. It's also talked about as being the volitional part of our reaction, so that we have some control over it. It may be unconscious, it may be something we don't feel we have control over, But through our practice, we can begin to see more and more the volitional nature of the citta, of our reaction, of our reactivity. And at least in Theravada Buddhism, the lineage that we practice here, citta is really considered the mind of subjectivity. In other words, how we interpret events that come into us, whether they're internal or experienced externally. That citta is the mind of subjectivity. So it's more the mind of our inner experience, and it may also be how we project outward. So what do I project onto you? What characteristics, what qualities do I attribute to you as we interact? And if you remember the 4 foundations of mindfulness that the Buddha taught in the Satipatthana Sutta, which is sort of considered really the most important of his teachings, he describes the 4 foundations of mindfulness, and citta is the third of the 4. And just to remind you, the first is mindfulness of the body. He always starts with the body. Mindfulness of feelings and sensations is the second. Mindfulness of the heart, mind, citta is the third. And then the fourth he calls mindfulness of the dharmas, which is things like the hindrances, the senses, the Four Noble Truths. He sort of lumps everything in the fourth one. But citta's right there as one of the 4, and it really does have a very important role in his teaching. And as we think about citta, it can be healthy, it can be skillful, or it can be unskillful or unhealthy. I mean, that's really our challenge, is what is it going to be? Is it going to be one or the other? And when citta is unskillful, when it's an unskillful mindset, we can become contracted, closed in, distracted. He talks about grown great is a term he uses to talk about inflated, feeling very pumped up and full of ourselves. But if we bring awareness to it, if we bring awareness to heart and mind, then we can begin to address those unskillful means. And he teaches us that the path to awareness of citta is threefold. It's through intention. We set the intention to look at, to make our citta a form of examination, something we're going to work with in our practice. Disengagement, meaning getting unhooked from those triggers. And then thirdly, discernment. And those are the sort of 3 ways that he talks about in terms of the path of awareness to our individual citta. And so the challenge for us, I think, is to see how the mind-heart really gets contracted and how we get caught. What are our buttons? What are my individual buttons that get pushed? And how do I respond to those when they get pushed? And that's where reactivity occurs. That's where it sort of resides. I would go so far as to say that I think reactivity really resides in the citta, in the mind-heart. And when we talk about healthy or skillful citta, dealing with citta in a healthy or skillful way, we talk about things like spaciousness, a focus, really understanding it, humility, a willingness to really look at ourselves honestly. So we can really be taken hold of, when we're talking about our citta, of either pleasant or unpleasant experiences. It really can split either way. This is from the Pali Canon. This is Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation. He says, "For a long time, this citta has been defiled by attachment, hatred, and delusion." We talk about greed, hatred, and delusion. That's what he's talking about there. So he says, for a long time, this citta has been defiled by attachment, hatred, and delusion. By defilement of citta, beings are defiled. By purity of citta, beings are purified. That's very fundamental teaching. And then he goes on to talk about how attaining a purified citta corresponds to our attaining liberating insights. That's where freedom is. That's where we get freedom from the suffering, freedom from all the challenges that we face when we're doing it unskillfully. And that a liberated mind, these liberating insights result in a liberating mind, which reflects what he says, which reflects no ignorance or defilements. And that as ignorance and defilements represent bondage, a form of bondage, their absence really is described in terms of freedom. That the freedom is the absence of these defilements, this bondage. And as I said a moment ago, we then experience an openness, a spaciousness, an ability to welcome whatever comes in and not be knocked off balance by it. And I think the teaching, which in some ways really best illustrates this, was one you've heard us speak about often here, is the parable of the two arrows. And the first arrow, if you remember, the Buddha talks about that first arrow is the unavoidable suffering in life that we all experience. The realities of life, loss, disappointment, what other forms of suffering that just are inevitable and unavoidable. That's the first arrow. But the second arrow is our reaction. It's the reactivity, really. So the second arrow is dukkha. It's what he talks about as that which we can deal with more skillfully or not. And so this is again from the canon. He says, when touched with a feeling of pain, the uninstructed, run-of-the-mill person suffers, grieves, and laments, beats his breast, becomes distraught. So he feels two pains, physical and mental. Just as if they were to shoot a man with an arrow and right afterwards were to shoot him with another one, so that he would feel the pains of two arrows. And then he goes on to say, now, the well-instructed disciple of the noble ones, when touched with a feeling of pain, does not sorrow, grieve, or lament, does not beat his breast or become distraught. So he feels one pain, physical, but not mental. Just as if they were to shoot a man with an arrow, and right afterward did not shoot him with another one, so that he would feel the pain of only one arrow. In the same way, when touched with a feeling of pain, the well-instructed disciple of the noble ones does not sorrow, grieve, or lament, does not beat his breast or become distraught. He feels one pain, physical but not mental. So when we're reflexively responding to our emotions as they come up as we get triggered, without any consideration of our response, without any ability to sort of see what our response is going to be, we're really functioning there on autopilot. We're sort of functioning there in what Tara Brach calls a trance. And we're not bringing mindfulness to our emotions. We're not dealing mindfully with our triggers. So there are many, many examples: flying off the handle, lashing out, angry withdrawal, speaking unskillfully, chastising ourselves, using self-protective mechanisms that further isolate us, like shutting down emotionally, withdrawing emotionally. The list goes on and on. So how does this develop? How does it happen that we developmentally become these reactive creatures? And there are many paths to this, and I think the Buddha talks about many of them, and I think also modern psychology has also talked about many of them, although without using the term reactivity. From the perspective of the Dharma, they develop through the forces of craving and clinging, which we talk so much about. Clinging to the idea that things should be different as they are. So you should treat me differently. The world should treat me differently. The weather should be different. That over time we form this reactivity by these forces of craving and clinging that we talk about frequently. From a psychological perspective, we would probably say that it occurs from early conditioning, developmental history, often things that get stored unconsciously. But that overall, reactivity originates from a psychological wound about whether that wound is about belonging, being ostracized, whether that wound is about intimacy or the inability to achieve intimacy, autonomy, security. All these things are where these wounds can occur and where we develop forms of reactivity in response to those wounds. But if we approach these experiences with a mindful and non-judgmental recognition of what's going on inside of us, we can start to build in that circuit breaker, that sacred pause. I mean, the real key here, and I'll come back to this in a few minutes, is our ability to insert a pause between the trigger and my response. And this has been a really powerful part of my own practice. And when I'm able to do it, it's very often, it's just, the trigger will happen, I'll feel the emotion or the response start to rise, and if I'm mindful, I can put the pause in there enough just to not have to react, just to not have to have my hair trigger pulled. And because so much of this is often outside of our conscious awareness, it becomes really critical when we're sitting and we're getting quiet. And this, again, is why we talk about this as insight meditation, is watching this stuff bubble up. Because as we get quiet, invariably, the mind will wander into an interaction I had today. And, oh, gosh, boy, somebody really pushed my button. I can begin to get a little separation then from my response then. Maybe next time I can do it a little more skillfully. But we really have to start to get quiet. I don't think we can do this successfully unless we're really putting in our time on the cushion or on the chair and bring this stuff, allow this stuff to become more into conscious awareness. And then once it's there, to begin to add that pause. The pause between the trigger and the response, the stimulus and the response. And as we're growing up, responses from parents, sibs, teachers, caretakers, peers, the world, what we see in media, whatever, all of these can shape this tendency that we have toward reactivity. We all form our own patterns of reactivity, and they're highly varied. It covers a huge amount of real estate. So, for example, if as a child I was ridiculed for crying when I hurt myself, I'm likely to develop a heightened sensitivity about being seen as too sensitive and being very reactive when that's implied or stated, or I believe that it's implied or stated. So then if someone suggests that I'm overly sensitive, I'm more likely to lash out defensively in a reactive way, become angry, push them away, whatever. And there are many, many examples that I'm sure any of us can cite where we do this in our own individual way, in our own individual scripts. We all have those patterns of conditioning. So this has really been a huge challenge for me in my own practice, this whole area, but in specific ways. And the pattern in my family was that there was lots of scrutiny, lots of teasing, ridicule growing up. That's just sort of how things got communicated in so many ways. So for me, and this differs from my siblings, but I grew up feeling very defensive, very hypervigilant, seeing or experiencing ridicule sometimes where it probably didn't exist, but being very hypervigilant about the possibility of ridicule or criticism or teasing. And so I grew up feeling very defensive about that. It's very exhausting. You're sort of constantly having to scan the horizon to see when it's coming next. The hypervigilance requires a huge amount of emotional energy. But, you don't, how else to be? I had no idea how else to be. I mean, to me, I was like a fish in water. It is what it is. And so this pattern developed where I'd get defensive, angry, annoyed, withdrawn, even if there was good-hearted teasing. I just had no ability to laugh at myself, much less have others or perceive that others were laughing at me. And the result, as I'm sure you can imagine, is this heightened sense of separation from others. There's a real sense of aloneness and a very painful sense of aloneness when this kind of reactivity causes you to put layers and layers of armor on to try to fend it off. We pay a huge price, I certainly did, for arming myself against this type of, having this type of reactivity be triggered. So what to do? How did we change it? How was my practice able to begin to give me some relief from the suffering caused by this pattern? So what we do is we begin mindfully again, as I said, consciously looking at this, watching what comes up, taking these interactions, these painful interactions onto the cushion, beginning to look at them, beginning to look at where I get triggered, what are the buttons that get pushed, what's my role in this pattern which is causing isolation and separation. And it's really where we bring the Dharma into our lives in a way that is so able to reduce our suffering. So with working with my teacher, it began with setting the intention to notice my reactivity and notice the patterns. So the instruction was, notice it on the cushion, notice it off the cushion. Whenever you feel triggered, check in, see what's going on, what's the transaction that just happened. And over time, we can learn to distinguish between responding skillfully, usually by putting the pause in, versus reacting in a negative, acting out kind of way. So we pause, we feel the pressure kind of release, we sort of feel the pressure of that emotion that sort of has to get out, dampen down a bit, and then we act with greater integrity. We don't react in a way that is angry, alienating, isolating, distancing, all those things. And so for a number of years, my practice edge has really been meeting these feelings, these moments of reactivity, with openness and compassion, and mostly compassion for myself. I mean, I think self-compassion is critical to this work when we're starting to look at how we get triggered. Because the first response is to be self-critical. What's wrong with me? Why can't I deal with this better? I mean, that was a lifelong theme. Why am I so sensitive? Why do I let this stuff bother me? And so whatever we're bumping into, that's our path, that's our edge. And each of us have these patterns, and as we approach them on the cushion again and off the cushion, that's our challenge. Is what's hindering our waking up? What is it that I'm doing that's causing me not to wake up to this pattern in my life? Last week we had the round table about white awake and white privilege. And there again we can begin to look at what's the reactivity around issues of race? What's the activity around issues of privilege? I mean, it's really everywhere in our lives. But without the challenge, without the suffering, we don't wake up, because if it's easy, why bother? It's the suffering that becomes the impetus, provides the impetus to begin to wake up to the patterns of reactivity that each of us experience in our day-to-day lives. And again, the freedom really comes from knowing those patterns, putting in the pause, not being controlled by our emotions, but being able to navigate through all these tricky waters that we do in our day-to-day lives. So I would argue that these feelings, which are fully felt, not pushed away, not denied, not repressed, feelings that are fully felt, mindfully held with some spaciousness, mindfully held, we can move past our reactivity and experience the release from that and the wisdom that comes with that. The wisdom that comes with the freedom of not being so easily triggered, by not being so highly reactive. And remembering that the ground of our path, the ground of our spiritual path, is acknowledging and accepting the true nature of things. Not as we want them to be, but as they are. And the Buddha talked about that repeatedly. So the path is to learn to live our lives from this awakened heart mind, this awakened citta. And by awakened, I mean open to it and able to manage the reactivity skillfully. This is from the author Sarah Nofke, and it's very similar to Rumi's poem on this, The Guest House. But she says, I don't run from my worries. I invite each one into my heart and mind. At the doorstep of my emotional threshold, I greet them like a perfect host. Each worry tracks mud into my home and dirties the furniture. I grit and bear my house guest. Their time with me will be short-lived. There again, the notion of being open to this Because when we're reactive, we shut it down. We don't want to experience it. We don't want to know it. We repress it. We run away from it. We cover it up. And something that you've heard me talk about in the past, which is so important here too, in all of our practice, is that issue of honesty. Honesty with ourselves in terms of what's really going on, honesty with others in terms of what's happening in the relationship. I've found that one of the places in which a lot of this work happens is in my closest relationships, because that's where I'm experiencing it, especially in the realm of closeness and intimacy. I think that's where a lot of us that's where the really, really hard work takes place, when we're dealing with those close, intimate relationships, because they can be pretty scary. And we bring all of our reactivity to our relationships. And I just know from years of working with other people how much reactivity in the way we've talked about it tonight disrupts and destroys so many relationships. And those of you in the room who are fellow therapists know this as well, because you see it in your office every day. I think another important piece of this inquiry is that when we are reactive, is then spend a little time reflecting on it, sort of looking back on it. How did it affect me in my body? What was the impact? What was going on in my body when I was reactive 10 minutes ago with you? What happened to my energy level? Did my energy really just crash? What was my mind state for minutes, for hours, for days? Was I ruminating, obsessing, worrying about it, figuring out other ways to protect myself? And really, again, doing an honest self-exploration of when I am reactive, what was the impact on me in all of those ways, my body, my mind, and so forth. Naming it. I'm reactive now because of my sensitivity. There was that again. Someone implied that I was overly sensitive about something. Naming it. Part of naming it is acknowledging the fact that we don't necessarily want to attribute those qualities to ourselves. That's one reason we don't want to do this work, is because these are qualities in us that we often want to push away. So I think just to summarize, I would say, looking at the citta, looking at the mind heart, articulating the thoughts, the sensations, the feelings, the impulses, which are part of our reactivity, and doing it honestly in an open way, working to build in that pause. That will be our challenge. That is our path in terms of being able to move along on our spiritual path. So as I often like to do, I want to close with a poem by Mary Oliver. Many of you know this one. It's called The Journey. She says, "One day you finally knew what you had to do and began, though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice. Though the whole house began to tremble and you felt the old tug at your ankles. 'Mend my life,' each voice cried. But you didn't stop. You knew what you had to do, though the wind pried with its stiff fingers at the very foundations, though their melancholy was terrible. It was already late enough and a wild night, and the road full of fallen branches and stones. But little by little, as you left their voices behind, the stars began to burn through the sheets of clouds, and there was a new voice which you slowly recognized as your own, that kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world. Determined to do the only thing you could do. Determined to save the only life you could save." So thank you. Any other thoughts? Okay, why don't we just sit for a minute?